minutes. And I think without further ado, we begin with the first paper, which is Jason Davidson and Fabrizio Coticchia. 15 minutes per paper.
Thank you. So our paper it's a little different than titled in the program. The Irrelevance of Radical Parties in Coalition Foreign Policy, Italy, and the Extremity Hypothesis. And the paper seeks to explain Italy as an anomaly in relative to kind of an intuitive idea and an expectation in the literature on coalition foreign policy. So the literature on coalition foreign policy in the past few years has generated this extremity hypothesis that has gotten some support. And the core idea of that hypothesis is that coalition governments made up of more than one political party, tend to produce more extreme foreign policies than governments made up of just single parties. And further, some have argued that actually when you have radical parties that are critical to the survival of the government, so we'll be referring to those as critical radical parties today. So, for example, what we're looking at is center-left governments that have far-left parties within those governments, far-left parties that can potentially force the government to collapse. That this expectation in the literature is that those kinds of governments lead to extreme foreign policies, and specifically that the far-left parties are able to, and do, hijack the policy of the sitting government. So there's this expectation in the literature. I should note parenthetically, if you're wondering, why do I care? I don't care about the literature on coalition foreign policy. That there happens to be, as I'm sure you're all aware, a debate in Italy now over the electoral system and whether to have a higher threshold for small political parties. And in fact, one of the arguments made for a higher threshold for parties is that these radical parties, particularly on the left, are hijacking government policy. Well, as I suggested initially, our paper is about an anomaly, and that anomaly is that Italy in the Second Republic, that is since the end of the Cold War, has had three center-left governments, probably fine, three center-left government cases where there have been these big debates about the use of force, about military operations, Italian military operations abroad. And in those three governments, there were critical radical parties, the Rifondazione Comunista, Partiti Comunisti Italiani, and the Verdi, and in varying distributions. That was critical for the survival of the government. In all three of those cases, in Albania, in Kosovo, and in Afghanistan, in all three of those cases, the critical radical parties were opposed to the either sending or keeping of Italian troops abroad. And in all three cases, those parties did not affect the government's policy. So our fundamental research question, so we begin by pointing out that this expectation that's in the literature is not held up in the Italian case. And then our research question is why. So how can we explain the fact that these parties who had this very clear preference against the government did not, in fact, impact government policy in these three cases, at least in the most fundamental sense? And so that leads me to our three hypotheses. I'm going to outline those three hypotheses very quickly and then turn it over to my colleague who's going to walk you through the case studies. The first hypothesis we refer to as the blame hypothesis, and this is basically the fear of negative political consequences that radical parties might suffer if they either threaten or force collapse of a government. So the blame hypothesis suggests that critical radical parties don't force government collapse or don't threaten to collapse a government over these issues because they're worried about the blowback that they will suffer. Either that voters will leave them because they're seen to be causing instability in the left, and so that either centrist voters might leave the left altogether and vote for the right, or that voters on the left might leave the radical left and vote more for the centrist parties in punishment for those parties for their action of threatening or forcing government collapse. A final possibility that actually emerged during the case studies, this is very inductive, is that the radical parties themselves fear not voter loss, they fear that there might be a recomposition of the coalition that would exclude them and bring in centrist parties in their place. And that might come up in some of the case studies. If not, I can talk about it later. So the first hypothesis is blame. The second hypothesis is relative salience. So here what we mean is that, yes, in all three of these cases, in Albania and Kosovo and in Afghanistan, these issues got attention in the media. They were debated in Parliament, yes. However, parties have varying levels of intensity of preference over different issues. And we argue that one of the reasons critical radical parties might not threaten or force government collapse is because they care more about domestic issues than military operations, and they care more about, they care less about foreign policy than the center-left may care. Okay? And therefore, they're less willing to put the government's survival on the line for these issues. I think there's some evidence Fabrizio talked about to cover that. Final hypothesis that we're interested in is not so much to explain the outcome, but it's what we call theatrical politics and implementation. And the idea here is that given that these radical parties choose not to threaten or force government collapse over these issues, their voters are angry. Their voters are not happy about the fact that they just either supported or abstained from a renewal vote on Afghanistan. So what do? The same politicians that vote in favor then go out in the streets and protest against the policy that they just voted in favor of. And we see that in a number of these cases. Or they affect in subtle ways the implementation of the, or maybe not so subtle ways, but they affect the implementation of the policy. So they may not force government collapse on engaging in the use of force in Kosovo, but they may have an impact on exactly when airstrikes start later than maybe the dilemma government would have liked, or other aspects of implementation of military operations like the rules of engagement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fabrizio.
Thanks, Jeremy. Just a very brief methodological premise before looking at the empirical part on case selection, definitions, and sources. We analyzed the three most important military operations undertaken by Italian center-left governments in the Second Republic, that depended on the radical parties for their survival, and when in these cases these radical parties opposed these operations. This is why we excluded the case of Lebanon, when at that time the radical parties were in favor of this operation. We adopted the definition of critical radical parties according to the purposes of the paper, defining critical radical parties as the most relevant parties in electoral terms that adopt transformative aims and collocate themselves to the left of the party of European socialists, as Professor Prospero said this morning. You are what you said, in a sense. And so, despite there is a controversial debate on the definition of radical parties, transformative parties, or communist parties, or even left parties, there is a shared definition of these for these political formations. Finally, the sources. We used parliamentary debates, newspaper articles through LexisNexis, electoral platforms, electoral results, portfolio allocations, and different types of secondary sources. Going briefly to the case of Alba, only 5 minutes, so we illustrate just the case of Alba. No, I'm joking. At that time, the Communist Foundation did not support the operation. And the party provided external support to the party's government. It was crucial for the survival of the government because the party obtained a remarkable 8.5% of the election. Prodi was able to authorize the mission at that time only thanks to the support of the center-right. A very important vote because at that time started a sort of bipartisan consensus of military operations abroad. However, the Fondazione never threatened the survival of the government. The message was very clear: no to the mission, but no to the crisis of the government. And also at the end of the crisis in the summer, the Fondazione voted in favor of extending the mandate of the operation Alba. So looking at the hypothesis, the blame hypothesis is relevant for this case. Communist Foundation was deeply concerned about the charge of being the Northern League, the Lega Nord of the center left after the normally caused the collapse of the Berlusconi's government. But above all, the leaders of the Fondazione Comunista clearly recognized that in the case of the collapse of the governments, the center right would have surely won the election, and moreover, the Fondazione would have lost several seats in the parliament, and Bertinotti would be considered a sort of traitor, a flanker. So the dissent was limited, clearly looking at the interviews, looking at the parliamentary debates, was limited to the military operation. Also the Greens, which supported the operations, clearly focused on the need to preserve the existing majority coalition. However, probably the relative silence is the most important factor here. The military mission was a low silence issue for the Fondazione, for the Greens, in comparison to other domestic things. Also looking at the electoral platforms, looking at defense issues, but also looking at the parliamentary debate, when D'Alema openly accused the Fondazione of considering all that just a minor issue, and the party never developed an effective counter-narrative regarding the operation. And finally, the third hypothesis, the theatrical politics implementation. Here, just two elements we can stress. First, the members of these two parties participating in different type of rallies, controversial rallies against the operation. Even the Minister of Environment by the Greens participated in this rally. The Fondazione and the Greens asked for a parliamentary commission for investigating the behavior of two diplomats, two ambassadors, Italian ambassadors in Albania. And above all, they tried to affect the structural implementation of the mission, enhancing the level of coordination, the role of NGOs, the role of humanitarian dimension of the operation. So all the three factors are relevant, but probably the salience issue is the most important. This is not the case of Kosovo, where the issue was silent for the three parties, but also for the new parties created after the collapse of the province government, the Comunisti Italiani. The issue was silent with the parliamentary debates. However, obviously, the relative silence was different, because for the senior party, the Left Democrats, was a very, very important issue. For the first time, Prime Minister faced a relevant crisis. And in addition, both Fondazione and the Greens never developed a counter narrative. In the case of Kosovo, the blame hypothesis is very relevant, because the Fondazione collapsed at the European elections. So there was a sort of a media campaign against the Fondazione as responsible of the collapse of the government. And despite their huge opposition by the Greens and by the Italian communists, these parties always supported in the parliament the operation, despite the fact that the vote on the operation was related to the crisis of the humanitarian operation in Albania. It's quite interesting to see the red lines posed by Consulta at that time. So our red line is that Italy never give the base to the NATO, and then Italy provide the base. We never provide our support to military intervention, and then they provide military support, and so on and so forth. In a sense, the need to avoid blame for being responsible for the collapse of the government, and the necessity to maintain a sort of image of a reliable party. The Comunisti Italiani was created, that was the main driver of one of the key elements of their nature, were stronger than the periods of inconsistency in their reforms. And finally, the theatrical politics implementation here are very, very important factors. If you think about it, when Consulta met Milosevic in Belgrade, the hunger strikes by the hunger secretaries of the Greens against the operation, the involvement in rallies against the operation, but probably the most important factor here is the capability of these parties in affecting the Italian foreign policy, for instance, limiting the targets, and also regarding the implementation of the operation, trying to call a stop for the bombs. So in a sense, the government at that time received the inputs from these parties. So all the three factors are relevant here, but probably the blame and the implementation hypothesis are the most important. Very, very, very briefly, I'm going to conclude looking at Afghanistan, where all the three hypotheses are, in a sense, confirmed by the empirical analysis. Also, in this case, we have a very relevant military operation, a huge opposition by the three critical radical parties against the operation, but apart some episodes or rebel senators in the parliament, these parties never opposed in the parliament to the operation and never threatened the survival of the government. As Diliberto said, one of the leader of the Comunisti Italiani, okay, I'm interested in Afghanistan, but I'm not so crazy to promote the collapse of the government for these issues. So the science was relevant, the blame, looking at what happened in the past was relevant, and also looking at the theatrical politics and implementation, how these parties affected, for instance, the rules of engagements, caveats, try to stop providing the new warplanes since 2006 to 2008. So also this hypothesis is confirmed. Going to the conclusion, in summary, all these factors are, in a sense, our evidence provides support for all three hypotheses, despite obviously some variance according to different cases. Obviously, our paper is the very draft at the very beginning, so any comments and remarks are welcome. Sorry for the time.
Thank you. So immediately going to Luca. Oh, you're just going to Okay, I'm sorry to keep passing this, but we have to keep it. I was at a conference in Taiwan once, and they rang a bell once, 5 minutes. Then 2 minutes, they rang it twice. Then they rang it 3 times, and you simply couldn't speak any longer. So I don't have a bell, but I have it.
50 minutes for question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Don't need to shout.
No. Sorry?
Don't need to shout. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Please.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers. Okay, I'll be honest to begin with. I didn't have a research on the Italian Communist Party or the Italian left and foreign policy, so I adapted an article that I wrote on the occasion on the 150th anniversary of Italian unification. And it is an article that deals with the history of Italian foreign policy and somehow with the theory of Italian foreign policy. It tries pretty much to harmonize a theoretical reading of the historical evolution of Italian foreign policy. So we'll start off with a very brief theoretical introduction. I use a realist framework for understanding how Italy has been pretty much conducting its foreign policy. And I come to the conclusion that this framework applies to all the Italian political forces. We spoke this morning, we heard ideas about Italy having to be as a bandwagon internationally. We touched upon the policy of alliances that somehow characterize Italian foreign policy since Cavour, actually even before unification came about. And my fundamental argument is that this theoretical reading applies consistently throughout the country history. What I'm saying is not that I'm denying that domestic politics plays a role. I agree with what, again, a couple of speakers said today, that domestic politics played an intervening role, but according to my viewpoint, empirical evidence doesn't support the fact that domestic politics was the main independent variable that has shaped the country's foreign policy. In this sense, the PCI makes no exception, and it had to adapt itself to these external pressures to which the country is subject. Well, we need to go back, what I want to do is to go back just briefly, well, to the history of Italian foreign policy. And if we consider pretty much for how long Italy's been an independent state, well, I think at least 4/5 of our independent history has been characterized by membership of different alliances. So only roughly less than 40 years, Italy's been trying pretty much to conduct itself independently on the international stage. And we all know there is an expression that was used to define an Italian attempt to, well, behave as an independent actor or as the least of the great powers. Well, every time Italy tried to go by itself, it ended up with a clear hands policy, an expression that dates back to the, well, famous or infamous Council of Berlin in 1878. Also, if you compare Italy, and a comparison came up today also in terms of domestic politics, to the national strategic discourse of 3 other main European, Western European countries, well, Of course, in the Italian political discourse, I never heard the idea of splendid isolation, and Italian isolation, I doubt that it would be splendid at all. We never had any talk, well, during the 50s or during the 60s, of Italy leading, together with France, maybe a European third force. Talks of a European third force, I think they were pretty much dismissed by the Italian, well, political and diplomatic establishment. If we had to choose, like, between different masters, it would be better, like, to pick up one in Washington than to pick up, like, one in Paris on, well, come about in Bonn. And also, if we compare it to Germany, it talks about Italian neutrality or Italian co-location within NATO. Well, of course, they are not comparable to the debate that Germany went through, like at the time of rearmament during the early 1950s. During Ostpolitik again, where there were fears pretty much, at least in part in the West, that Germany would go back on its own Sonderweg, or special path in foreign policy. Again, I'm not sure if Italy can afford a special path in foreign policy. And finally, at the time of Germany's unification, when again talks about, well, Germany coming out, united outside of NATO, were pretty much, at least partially, temporarily revived. So again, the PCI makes no exception, and in a sense, its relationship with the Atlantic Alliance was pretty much shaped by the evolution of the international system, rather than by internal political dynamics. So how the party has dealt, pretty much, has come to, from a position of fierce opposition in the 1940s to the gradual embracement of the transatlantic relationship, transatlantic values, and the alliance with the United States, is best accounted for as a response to systemic incentives, systemic stimuli. Although the internal evolution of the party, the links with the social democratic parties from the 60s, of course, also played a role. So embracement of NATO came about as a foregone conclusion, as an inescapable destiny. Now, I begin during the Cold War, actually, although the paper should focus on the post-Cold War period, and here I identify three main systemic stimuli that led to the evolution in the position of the PCI. Well, the first one comes about in the mid-1950s with the consolidation of the two blocs that makes it clear that any, well, communist hope of equidistance between the two blocs or Italian neutrality was pretty much an illusion. Again, Hungary was mentioned today. In 1956, a huge number of members, well, the Communist Party, Ambassador Renzi spoke about 1 million. I thought, well, slightly less, but still, decided to leave the party. The second, and again, Hungary was a big trigger in the process that led to the separation between the Communist Party and Socialist Party in Italy, well, to the idea of political cooperation between these two forces. The second big systemic stimulus came about instead as a result of the consolidation of the process of détente. So during the late 1960s and early 1970s, by the time the Helsinki conference had been convened, the mutual imbalance cost reduction conference started, it was clear that the two blocs had acknowledged each other, not only politically, but also militarily. So what Berlin-Ware did in 1976 wasn't so much innovating, it didn't really play the role of innovator. I guess he played more the role of a notary, of understanding what was happening, well, of acknowledging what had happened already at the international, external level. And the last and most powerful systemic stimulus came about, well, with the end of the Second World War, the beginning of glasnost and perestroika, of course, in the Soviet Union, and the prospect of a disintegration of the entire Soviet bloc. Don't forget that in the second half of the 1980s, the Communist Party begins to suffer very significant losses in the electoral consensus throughout the country. So, of course, during the Cold War, there was a process of social learning that was aided by the contacts with the British Labour Party, partially with the German Social Democratic Party. But when the Cold War came to an end, this process of social learning had not been completed. And, well, in order to make this clear, I focus on the two main preferences that were expressed by the party leaders at the time of making the party, well, accelerating the transition of the party into what would become the Democratic Party of the Left, and after the first visit by Pietro to the United States. Well, at that point, again, Italian communist leaders were thinking of the idea that the end of the Cold War wouldn't necessarily maintain the current Italian relationship with NATO, but it would have to bring about a bigger transformation of the European status quo. I think the catchword, or the favorite term that was used during the Bologna, during the Rimini Congress, was the idea of, again, overcoming the two blocs, an idea that dates back, again, pretty much to the PCI views of the 50s and partially early 60s. And Occhetto himself was arguing for a disintegration of NATO's integrated military command, for overcoming the alliance, and for the creation of a common European home, a more inclusive pan-European security system that again resounded pretty much of the Soviet idea, probably been SARS. I talked about, well, this idea of a common European home that would provide indivisible and equal security for all the European states. Well, at the same time, this view was reinforced by the idea that it would be about time that NATO coordinated better its action with the United Nations. And this is a view that, of course, it was needed to intervene in the during the first Gulf War that became particularly relevant while operations in Iraq started. There's a second news that was supported by Napolitano, a more, I would say, like a more forward-looking wing within the party, that instead supported the idea that it would be about time to develop a European component in security, foreign policy, and maybe also defense. It sympathizes with the idea of Mitterrand, of a common European security, foreign policy that somehow could become, in the future, also an alternative to NATO. What is my view? Well, all this was a lot of window dressing, a lot of political talk, but at the end of the day, it came to have to be confronted with the systemic transformation of the international system. And especially here, there are three systemic constraints that limited these views from being transformed into reality. First of all, the fact that the United Nations was unprepared to deal with regional conflicts that erupted after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The international system remained anarchic. There would be no end of history after the end of the Cold War. If anything, there would be a risk that, well, we could go back to the future. And how Yugoslavia especially was dealt with initially by the United Nations made this pretty clear. The second systemic constraints comes about from the fact that, well, the European countries, although there are talks about a common European foreign policy, they proved that they were pretty much still divided. So also the idea of a European alternative to NATO proved pretty much unrealistic, illusory. And thirdly, also the persistent Italian unpreparedness to deal with conflicts or regional crises and the risk of becoming entrapped now in the post-Cold War regional conflicts. So what is the turning point? Well, according to my view, I think the big turning point comes about by the mid-1950s, pretty much after the intervention of NATO in Bosnia, that makes it clear by then that the alliance will remain the premier security institution in Europe, and that any talk of a pan-European system remained pretty much illusory. Well, the Olive Tree Coalition, again, that was mentioned earlier, by 1995 and even more by 1996, has accepted that Italy will remain a proactive member of the alliance. And this change is, I will try to be a little bit quicker, this change is further reinforced by what happens in Kosovo pretty much in 1999, while D'Alema decides pretty much that Italy will participate to the operation, despite making a case that in this case the participation, despite the lack of a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, was made somehow, was legitimated by the humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. Because if we made a comparison, I think the Bosnian War was a much bigger case of a humanitarian crisis than Kosovo, happening a few years earlier. But again, on those occasions, the Italian left, especially the Democratic Party of the left, had insisted pretty much strongly on the need for a UN Security Council resolution to legitimize the intervention of NATO. So what D'Alema does, again, in 1999, substantially, end of 1998, early 1999, is to acknowledge a status quo, a situation of a state of being that no single Italian party, be this on the left or on the right, could have changed. Do I still have 1 minute?
1 minute.
Sorry. Well, having said that, internal tensions remains, so the process of social learning has not been completed, and of course I will not talk too much about this. We saw Alba early. Maybe it's worth mentioning the tension, the discussion that erupted after the Chermis incident back in 1998, and of course we saw again the resistance of Rifondazione, but also the Italian Communist Green during the Kosovo War. But this is again an appendix. Why? Because after Kosovo, especially after the Anglo-French summit of Saint-Malo and the Nice Treaty have made it clear that there will be no European alternative to the alliance, well, there is little choice left, well, to Italy's left, than not to align itself with the traditions of Italian foreign policy. And I think I will cap now on the remaining part, because otherwise it will go pretty much far too long. And I think the substantial continuity, though, that what the center-right and the center-left have demonstrated on Italy's relationship with the alliance from 1999 until today, despite the discussion, the brief discussion during the Italian involvement pretty much in Iraq in 2003, confirms the fact that, well, when it comes to serious business internationally, Italian political parties are constrained by systemic pressures.
Thank you. Exactly 15 minutes. Jean-Pierre, you have
exactly 15 minutes.
50 minutes, yes.
Good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to speak about the 2014 Ukrainian crisis and the analysis of Italian left policy. Obviously, I have written something like 12 pages, but I will give you highlights today. Matteo Renzi became Prime Minister the 22nd of February. The very same day, Ukrainian protesters invaded the presidential building in Kiev, a turning point in the Ukrainian crisis. This quickly led to the Russian organized plebiscite in Crimea. Obviously, in Italy, a new government was appointed and producing a lame-duck period as portfolio passed from hand to hand. Nevertheless, very quickly, both Renzi and the newly appointed Foreign Minister, Federica Mogherini, stuck to the EU position, insisting on a diplomatic initiative, eschewing references to NATO to avoid upsetting Moscow. Italian representatives openly declared their affinity with the German position, keeping some distance from Poland and France, considered outliers. Mogherini has been several times very cautious on the avoiding some details, working together with Italy-EU partners on the Ukrainian crisis. Mogherini summed up her policy with the often quoted British expression, "Keep calm and carry on." I'm quoting. Renzi, for his part, reiterated more than once that Ukraine must remain united and that the Geneva Agreement should be respected. Yet, the new government continued to promote dialogue with Russia and made it clear it wanted to avoid any kind of military escalation. Italy also showed conflict about sanctions, fearing economic consequences at a time when its feeble economy was just starting to show some nice sign of recovery. I have to mention that once Defense Minister Roberta Pinotti spoke once of sending a peacekeeping force into Ukraine. But this reference to the use of military tools remained isolated, and Mogherini kept insisting on diplomacy and dialogue. If we consider the political spectrum from BD to CEL, we can observe a rather unanimous preference for a soft position. I know that it's qualificatively criticized by some people, but I'm using it. Soft position towards Russia, insisting on diplomatic tools, and never nearly qualifying the behavior of Russia as a threat in need of a military action of any type. The position of the Italian government could be summed up in a repetition of "it's bad, let's talk." Several elements can explain this rather soft approach. The timing, see what I said, the transition period. The historical continuity of Italian-Russian relations involving non-state actors such as the the evolution of relation with the USA. And in addition to that, there is an underlying pacifist trend which we can observe in the continuity of position between Mario Monti, Enrico Letta, and Renzi governments. I would like also to show how Italian geopolitical thinking has looked at this crisis as a classic game of power analysis, leading one of its key figures, Carlo Jean, to advocate for a soft Italian line, thus reinforcing once again the plurality of interests at stake in Italy and the reluctance to take an ideological position. My thesis is that this Ukrainian case reveals the composite aspects of Italian foreign policy, made up of a plurality of actors, and illustrate the strong continuity of foreign policy between left and right when called to govern. In the current 21st century context, the ideological content of foreign policy or foreign projection is fading in favor of a classic pros and cons games, which reflect the realist and post-ideological formation of new governmental elites. Another interesting point is a change in Italy's transatlantic relationship. While it used to be one of the two pillars of Italy's international position, it is now more of a domestic dimension, which paradoxically has less of an effect on the country's international policy. This aspect also supports, obviously, the development of theoretical approaches to Italian foreign policy. So my first point is about the continuity of policy towards Russia. Since in 1999, Eni and Gazprom signed a partnership. In 2006, the signing of a gas contract during then Premier Romanos Prodi's visit to Russia represents an often quoted turning point for bilateral relations between the two countries. Both left-wing and right-wing governments have supported this policy. On the left side of the political spectrum, we have to mention that Prodi has also always defended a vision that called for deeper economic cooperation between Russia and the EU, as he did the same also with China. In the first decade of the millennium, we can therefore observe a bipartisan convergence around the need to maintain and improve relations with Russia, based on the development of economic exchange, but also on the idea that Russia is a potential partner for the EU to be engaged in further cooperation. This bipartisan convergence also corresponds to the transformation of Italian diplomacy role after the Cold War, with a greater accent placed on fostering economic relations. The promotion of the so-called Sistema Paese has been a leitmotif of Italy's foreign policy vision since the 1990s. That is said, we can observe some differences in style. I have written a few pages of that I want to comment, but obviously there is a difference between Berlusconi's friendly side with Vladimir Putin and left side approach to Russia. Style might be important, sometimes important. Italian's left approach has also a constituency which leads it to the focus on the promotion of human rights. But there is a problem here between style and substance. Certainly, the question of human rights in Russia and Ukraine has been advocated by the Italian left. Some PDs, MPs, and CEL took the initiative in parliament, calling for asylum rights for Ukrainian opponents. Vincenzo Amendola, the chairman of the PD group of the Chamber of Deputy Foreign Committee, visited Kiev in May 2013 and met with the Maidan Committee. So there is a voicing of the Italian left on human rights issues and initiatives. But so one could say that the difference between right and left of Russia is a left-wing human rights constituency, which however tends to come in second after the consideration of other types of interest. In the past, the Partito Radicale was a champion of human rights campaigns, and the presence of Elmar Bonino, one of its most prominent leaders in the former government, can be seen as a form of endorsement of this topic by today's left. Another important point is about Mediterranean. Let's say that the Mediterranean scenario is a priority for the new government. First international visit of Matteo Renzi was in Tunisia. So Italy wants to stabilize the region and maintain key economic links with southern shore partners. Oil and gas on one side, but also immigration. And obviously, both people flooding Italy through the Canal of Sicily. And the main provenance, or the main area where those people are coming now is Syria. So very, very rapidly. There is a big interest for Italy to stabilize this region, and also having in mind the situation of human rights, civil rights, whatever you want to call it, in Syria. This is the reason why former government has engaged, and Bonino had engaged a dialogue with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in that overview. And this can also explain that Italy considers a priority to still keep the channels open with Russia. When we think about the Italian left and Russia, we could remind the old times, you know, exchange between the Italian Communist Party and the CPSU. Those times are over. Now, and it has been commented since the 1990s, former communists, then became PD, first expressed a strong pro-West and pro-US attitude. Massimo D'Alema, who backed NATO and the USA in the bombing campaign against Kosovo Serb forces in 1999. In the decade following, in the 2000s, obviously the US, the left governments in Italy have backed all kind of international NATO intervention. But lately, there has been a transition. We have seen some, let's say, some cultural transition, quite interesting in Italy, with some PD responsible becoming quite involved and interested in the US Democrats. You know, Walter Veltroni might be an example, but Federica Mogherini has made a career, for example, within the International Affairs Department of the DS. And since 2007, she has traveled extensively to the US, and she met very frequently for working meetings the Democrats, US Democrats. So there is this acquaintance, and there is a kind of translation. You know, US used to be an international reference. It became somehow now a domestic reference, specifically within the PD. This has to say that on the left side of the PD, there is a critical vision still toward NATO and toward America. I won't enter into details, but you know, military expenditures, F-35 program, MUOS radars in Sicily. I mean, all these produce a broad, let's say, a broad universe where there is a strong critique towards NATO and military expenditure. So, and the government has to deal with that. Also because it has to face a competition with N5S, a five-star movement, sorry, which is not a classic left movement, but it has political instances which clearly reflect a left agenda, and specifically against NATO, against military expenditure. So there is also an internal competition, which means that can explain this quite articulated Italian position. Another point that could be made, and that been also described by some of the colleagues, is the presence of what I call a pacifist trend within Italy's government. The presence of Comunità di Sant'Egidio responsible in the former government, so in today's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as a junior minister position, is an aspect of it. And obviously, this Committee of Sant'Egidio is a non-state actor, so cannot be assimilated in Italian, complete Italian policy. There is a complex game, we could talk about that, but it leads also to some kind of, let's say, cautious trends, I would say, from the Foreign Affairs Ministry. Finally, is it about geopolitics? Is it about Russian gas? You know, you have this school now in Italy who says, oh, you know, we keep the channels open with Russia because, yeah, we have the gas going through Ukraine and it's a benefit. Okay, well, certainly gas is important, but it's not the only thing. Other very important economical points can be made. SMEs, exportation of goods, tourism, agricultural export, direct investments in Italy, and obviously, what I mentioned before, the diplomatic channel for the Mediterranean, Middle East. So, any is not everything. And my thesis is that we cannot simply say that any is shaping foreign policy. It would be really ingenuous to say, and I can come back on. This reflects another trend, and I'm going to quickly conclude on that in 2 minutes. Okay, reflect another trend, which is the geopolitical mindset of Italian political since 1990s and the creation of the political review Limes, geopolitical thinking has been spreading in Italy. I won't comment that. Elisabeth's writing are quite interesting on that side. What my colleague Marco Antonsi speaks about real geopolitics, a realist vision of the interest aspect. Obviously, in the same side, Italian has grown. Italian foreign policy really emerged, and also on the military side, you know, a huge contributor to international missions. So there is some kind of geopolitical thinking of the national interest, and obviously a growing role of Italy. So it means that today, for example, on the Ukrainian case, Carlo Jean, which is the author of the Manuale di Geopolitica, published an article advocating a low profile for Italy and Germany and giving up Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine to Russia. Now, Carlo Jean cannot be associated really to the left. He's a former general, he was advisor. he was Francesco Cossiga, military attaché, among other things, retired Alpine general. Nevertheless, we can observe that his conclusions on the Ukrainian case and Italy's position largely match the soft lines expressed by Renzi's government. Conclusion, really fast. Even if the outcome is the same, the government's approach to the Ukraine crisis seems much more complex than a simple realist game of interest. While the Renzi administration adopts a neo-geopolitical culture of interest and pragmatic politics, it puts a moral question into the game. In the Ukrainian case, the indirect issues of human rights in the Mediterranean area seems to counterbalance the direct one of human rights in Ukraine. This also illustrates the complexity of Italy's foreign policy constituency. We can observe interesting elements that could support further investigation on issues such as the role of sub-state actors like public-owned company, ENI or Finmeccanica in the Ukrainian case, the role of sub-state actors like Catholic Association Comunità Sant'Egidio, the transformation of the US role within Italy's political culture, or the growth of geopolitical thinking in Italy and the consequences in terms of vision or lack of vision for the formulation of foreign policy. No single approach can provide a definitive key to Italian foreign policy, since a complete toolbox is needed, a multiple set of keys in a country with such complex political mobilization. And I have other things to say, but I will stop. Thank you very much.
I'll speak from the podium, and Livia will take over at some point in the middle of my presentation as well. So first thing to say is that we also changed the title of the paper, so we're not going to talk about Renzi's first 100 days in foreign policy and interim assessment, because there was too little to talk about, very frankly. So we decided to write something else, something else that we were both kind of interested in, and this again started over coffee, and then it becomes more than one coffee and blah blah blah. So the paper is now called "Ideas from the Left: The Foreign Policy Discourse of the Partito Democratico." Now, the first kind of rationale, the first motivation was simply the very kind of short-term one. We're about to take over the EU presidency for 6 months. We were kind of worried about the lack of articulation of ideas within the PD currently. And the discourse about foreign policy. This, of course, was set in the context of a longer kind of concern about the kind of unfinished process of transition. So at the end of the Cold War, right, with the end of the Cold War, and also 10 years after 2001, the twin attacks, we found that this kind of process of adaptation and ideation of renewal hadn't really happened. So far, what we've seen also under Renzi has been a very hesitant, very perfunctory, very reactive, ad hoc foreign policy that doesn't really sit in a really kind of renewed foreign policy paradigm. There's one other trend that kind of pushed us to sort of write this paper and think about this issue, which is kind of something that a few people talked about. So this kind of bipartisan convergence, right? So, and I think I've sort of written it in another paper, which then became the book. There is definitely a convergence post 2005 after the decision to kind of withdraw from Iraq between left and right. But I argue that this convergence is not about bipartisanship, but it's actually about the neutralization of foreign policy in the kind of public debate. So literally, if we think about bipartisanship and we try to find the rationale for bipartisanship, let's not look at kind of spurious relations. Perhaps one key variable is simply the process of a creeping kind of neutralization, neglect, and stagnation of the foreign policy discourse. And I think Livia will say a little bit about that. And lastly, we were both interested in the role of ideas and the role of kind of foreign policy traditions, especially within the Italian left, which is actually a tradition that is very long. And this despite the fact that in Italy, yes, the kind of materialist explanations are still very predominant. So, you know, geopolitical explanation, realist and hyper-realist explanations obviously have the sort of, you know, pride of place. So our main argument is that if we think about the foreign policy discourse of the left, and in particular the PD, we see that this has oscillated between a deliberate ambiguity on the one hand and a convenient form of pragmatism on the other. Two conclusions from this. Both strategies are, on the one hand, ultimately, I think, problematic, especially because I think, you know, towards the sort of, you know, in this kind of phase in particular, pragmatism has taken the upper hand over ambiguity, and this poses a series of problems that I will try to speak to towards the conclusions. And the other conclusion is that this foreign policy discourse and the way it's been either ambiguous, deliberately ambiguous, or pragmatic says something about the PD itself. So it's interesting to look at foreign policy and the foreign policy discourse because it tells us something about the PD, right? So it's a litmus test. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand it over to Lilia for the, you know, richer part and more interesting part, of course.
Okay, thanks. So, okay, after that Elisabetta has illustrated basically our theoretical opinions, I will try to shed some sort of empirical light on this consideration by providing an account of the PD's foreign policy discourse since the party's foundation in 2007, basically up to nowadays. So what we did was mainly concerning ourselves with the party's constitution, its electoral manifestos, the main political leader speeches, and the motions that all candidates presented throughout the various rounds of party leadership primaries. So, of course, during this short presentation, I won't have the time to go through all the empirical material, but I'll try to come up with a few meaningful points. So let us begin with the first phase that we can identify with the making of the PD itself. So I'd like to contextualize this initial development of the party's foreign policy discourse in the light of two factors that strongly jeopardized the identity building process of the new war organization. So, first of all, let us remember that the various ways the party's founders conceived the PD itself were deeply different and sometimes definitely impossible to reconcile. Then, second point, let's emphasize the DS and the DAISY merged precisely in order to create a stable, moderate, majority party willing to talk to both traditional left-wing constituencies and to the middle class. So, such an electoral strategy clearly imposed some sort of catch-all attitude, mainly consisting in leaving divisive issues aside, replacing political objectives with some sort of ethical, non-controversial statements, and more generally, in framing rather universalistic, politically correct partisan discourse. So, in the field of foreign policy, this is actually very well mirrored by the two main foreign policy relevant documents for those years, which are the 2007 Manifesto di Valori, value statement, and the 2008 General Elections Manifesto. So both the documents are characterized by some sort of third way vision, reminiscent of the British New Labour and the Clintonian New Democrats. So, for instance, globalization is presented as an opportunity not to be missed, and there's plenty of references to human rights and to sort of classic liberal leitmotif. Although it's important to specify that such principles are not fully and coherently translated into a cosmopolitan foreign policy discourse. Then, second important point, it's also interesting to notice that the traditional center-left enthusiasm towards European political integration is also here counterbalanced by a strong emphasis on the importance of the transatlantic partnership. So we can conclude that in this initial phase, the at that time leadership had, at least on paper, a few core foreign policy relevant ideas. Although, and this is the core of our argument, we suggest that such ideas were neither fully developed nor shared by the parties of whom since the party remained highly divided and fractionalized. Then, in the course of the paper, we try to suggest that such characteristics constantly persisted throughout the following years. In order to do that, we deal with Pierluigi Bersani's 2 victories during the 2009 and 2012 leadership primaries. And we suggest that those 2 victories absolutely do not mean a definitive consolidation of a dominant coalition, but more simply represent the temporary preeminence of one among many sensibilities, of one among many paradigms within the PD. So again, in the field of foreign policy, this leads to, as Elisabetta was saying, a substantial lack of elaboration and critical thinking, so to a general stagnation, and also to the crystallization of extreme divergences. So again, I'm sorry to rush up, but I really want to provide you guys with a sort of full overall account. We do that empirically, emphasizing the different nuances that are evident in the 2009 and 2012 primary motions. So from Dario Franceschini's rather playwright account of globalization to Pierluigi Bersani's call for global justice and for the construction of a social democratic European common platform, ended up with Renzi's zero enthusiasm and substantial neglect of the other relevant international regime. But again, we also suggest that all these documents can be blamed for, first of all, merely focusing on the least controversial of the Italian foreign policy dossier, which is precisely the European integration one, and also for a substantial lack of elaboration and critical thinking. Then, again, I'm rushing off a bit, but to provide you with an overall picture, let's go to the party's current state. So we suggest that the fact that the party closed its ranks behind Renzi doesn't mean that this variously composed majority shares as a whole Renzi's vision, and doesn't mean that all these groups owe him any personal loyalty. So this, together with Renzi's own pragmatism and with his lack of interest in framing a coherent partisan identity and political culture, concord to explain the persisting ambiguity and vagueness of the partisan foreign policy discourse. Let me just conclude by saying that, again, we are telling the tale of 2 different policy paradigms. So, for instance, if we have a look at the 2013 primary motion presented by Giuseppe Civati, it's a bit like the darling of the social movements and of the party's more radical circles, we can see how it builds upon some sort of traditional left-wing pacifism. Or, again, on a completely different note, if you look at Enrico Letta's first speech as a prime minister of parliament, you can observe how he argues very strongly in favor of solid collocation of Italy in the Western camp and defends the importance of protecting the Italian commercial, defense, and energy interests. So, of course, there is evidence that Renzi is closer to Letta's and Veltroni's vision. But, again, we want to underline how we think that, anyway, this position is not fully shared by the majority of the party and still lacks some sort of macro perspective, being mainly limited to sort of a local horizon. So, just towards the conclusion, the paper is still very much of a draft, so suggestions are welcome, but we think that even at this preliminary stage, the empirical analysis is to confirm our theoretical argument that I was suggesting, and we strongly believe, on a more political note, that the challenge for the current leadership lies precisely in this process of selection and synthesis of different policy paradigms and of idea generation.
Elizabeth,
just 1 minute to kind of elaborate on the conclusions, I guess. So unless that happens, unless this happens, what we will be stuck with is either a foreign policy of minimum, sort of lowest minimum denominator, so that we don't upset, the coalition. And that is the validation of Panebianco's old thesis about Italian foreign policy that is domestically kind of, determined, and hence it's neutralized because the domestic is so, so hot. I mean, it's such a hot, dimension to deal with. Or we're going to be stuck with pragmatism. And despite me having edited a book on pragmatism as a philosophical tradition in international relations, I'm deeply suspicious of pragmatic foreign policy because it's small letter P, it's not capital letter P, of course. Very briefly, why is it problematic? Because Renzi's foreign policy, when it's pragmatic, it's practically interchangeable with the center-right. So, you know, what's left of the left? If we're going for pragmatism, they do it a lot better than, you know, than the left. Secondly, what is pragmatism? Does that mean simply a kind of a carte blanche authorization to take decisions, essentially in the absence of accountability, and sort of having to check with the party leader, with Renzi, constantly, you know, what is our position? You know, what is our position? So everyone needs to align to kind of this, you know, this very powerful leader, obviously. Thirdly, pragmatism is extremely vulnerable to be co-opted, to be appropriated by particular interests, right? And this, I think, is a very, very, you know, problematic point if we think about the role of precisely what Jean-Pierre was talking about earlier, non-state actors, and so on and so forth, and you know, setting off really a kind of a democratic party that has a kind of, you know, democratic deficit when it comes to its both internal politics and foreign policy, cannot really claim to be democratic in the tradition of, you know, the democratic foreign policy that we had since the unification of the country. So we'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Elizabeth, what's the situation with regard to the next round table? Do we have 50 minutes extra?
Yeah.
Later on.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, let's keep it sort of 35 at the latest. So essentially 20 minutes from now.
20 minutes. So we have 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have the comments as well. So,
Yes, that's true.
so if you could limit your comments.
I'll try to be as brief as possible.
And then we have time for
So it's an even more difficult task. Okay, so I'm not going to follow the order of the presentations because one of the things I want to try to do is to put some of the papers in dialogue, as well as raising at least one or two questions, hopefully for each of the papers. So I'm going to start with the discussion of Jean-Pierre's paper in relation to Elisabetta and Lilia's, because I think they are the two papers that are most in dialogue, and then I'm going to try to bring in the others as well. And in a way, you're talking about the same thing, the same developments, but from two perspectives that are almost at odds with each other, because I'm simplifying a lot, but the one aspect of the story you're telling is that the Renzi's foreign policy is post-ideological, bipartisan, it's based on pros and cons, it's pragmatic. And one thing that you didn't get to talk about, but struck me towards the end of your paper, actually at the very end of your paper, you endorse this kind of post-ideological approach. You say that Renzi is a model for other forms of left, and you end with an expression which was also used by Professor Pasquini. The paper ends with a bright future. This paper, on the other hand, tells a different kind of story, where it's also familiar in a way story. It's the story of us social democrats, I guess, where it's you start, and this you didn't get to in your presentation, with saying Italy, the Italian left has a great tradition of democratic internationalism, which starts with Mazzini, Salvemini, and this embodied the Italian Italian left's foreign policy during the Cold War, and then it turned out that after the Cold War, we don't have any. We've lost our bearings. We don't know where to go. The Italian left, and so here pragmatism and post-ideology comes back. But you kept using words like it's a lack, it's unarticulated, it's consensual, it's neutral, and this, I guess, from a normative perspective, implied more of a critique. So I wanted to ask you how you answer each other's questions, because you both raise objections to each other in your paper. So starting with you, one point that they didn't discuss in the paper, but they raised at the beginning, is that this idea of post-ideological is actually the most ideological form of foreign policy that there is. That soft power actually presupposes hard power. So how do you address this point that this kind of pragmatism is actually the most ideological? But mostly, what I'm most interested in is the objections that especially Elisabetta raised at the end, where while you endorse the bright future of Renzi's post-ideological foreign policy, it seems to me that I'm just going to repeat the objection that she raised at the end, which is it's authoritarian. Like it all goes back to Renzi. Renzi decides. It's or plebiscitarian is maybe a better term. It's open to being captured by private interests, and you talk about the role of any, which you relativize, but becomes important. I'm just repeating, maybe you will have an opportunity to respond. And one other point you raise, it condemns Italy to a kind of reactive foreign policy. Because we don't have this ideological form of democratic internationalism, Italy condemns itself to a sort of second-rank reactive foreign policy. Okay, so this goes to you. So one thing he raises less criticisms of this more traditional social democratic position, but one is a classic question too, which is what you present as the Italian left's traditional democratic internationalist vision. How is it? There's a risk, at least in many social democrats, to make an idealized past of what the Italian left was during the Cold War. And was there not deliberate ambiguity in the Italian left during the Cold War? Togliatti, the doppiezza togliattiana. It seems to me that maybe if you want to develop the paper, one thing could be to nuance this sort of glorious 30s picture of how Italy was during the Cold War. And on the other hand, this is more of a question that, paradoxically, I think you could raise the same objection you raise against pragmatism to yourselves, in the sense that you present this sort of consensual, universalist, contemporary, depoliticized foreign policy as a lack of a foreign policy. You keep saying it's a lack, there's nothing to talk about. But raising the question you raised to him, is not this precisely a content, a form of depoliticized content? It's not a lack. Renzi is not that he doesn't have a foreign policy, it's that his foreign policy consists in, and there are values in this kind of pragmatism. Maybe you disagree with them, and maybe I do too. But the narrative that you're saying is there was this great, full, idealistic foreign policy in the Cold War, and now there's nothing on the left. Needs to be nuanced. Although maybe I'm more sympathetic to this narrative than to the other, but that's another story.
The next question.
Yes, I now get to the realism. I had 5 minutes for now, right? I'm going to take another 4. Yes, this brings in the realism, which can enter into this debate. You want to give. I'm going to base myself a little bit on the comments that you gave and also on the document that you sent me. Basically, the argument of your paper, as far as understanding it, what is realism explains best why the Italian left has gradually, over the course of the past 6 years, come to accept NATO. And so the debate is it's the old debate between realism and whatever is on the other side of realism. And if I try to understand what you mean by realism, this was what troubled me most in reading your paper. It was not clear to me what debate you were actually engaging in and what realism stood for. Because the traditional idea, I guess, is somehow realism is the idea that politics is about interests and power, not about ideas and ideologies. But then, of course, everybody knows this dichotomy doesn't really hold, because what's in my interest is determined by what ideas I have. So actually, the category you really use is, especially in the document you sent, systemic or structural reasons as opposed to unit-level reasons. So realism would be the theory that the Italian left is determined not by what the Italian left thinks, but by structural constraints. The only problem is that I think already in classical realism takes as its units not political sensibilities, political currents, political councils, but states, right? So, and already there it's problematic to treat the state as a unit. But when you transfer this idea of the unit to a current, to a political current like the Italian left, it becomes very difficult to distinguish the unit from the structure. Because for example, views of the left in general in Europe part of the unit or the structure? So I think that the application of the realist framework in a post-statist, like to explain the left, it becomes problematic. And I think this comes up in the analysis of one of the cases that you discussed, which is, for example, the NATO, the when D'Alema entered into the NATO in Kosovo. Because there you want to say, for example, you insist that the real reason was not that he wanted to distinguish himself from the communists, but that there was no alternative, the European security alternative wasn't available. But so I'm not sure how you can make a judgment like that when the variables are a bit fuzzy like that. What's a real, why is this explanation more real than the other? Why does it hold more than the other? What's the criterion of reality here? It seems to me both are valid. And so maybe it's because the dichotomy that you're posing doesn't work, that it's difficult to make the distinction of what is the most important variable. Last point about the, I really thought your paper was really, really interesting and really strong. And I intend these comments that I'm going to give you in a constructive sense. But it really seems to me that the frame you give to your paper somehow put me off from reading it. What is this extremity? What's extremist foreign policy? In your case, extremist foreign policy is not wanting to go to war. In Italy, in the cases that you discuss, extremist foreign policy, there were flags all over Italy of people who wanted peace. And in the way you code your variables, it seems that the extreme case is not wanting to go to war. All the arguments you gave about blame, about relative statements, seems to me to work better if you reframe your paper about explaining another problem, not the extremity hypothesis, which seems to me problematic on empirical and normative grounds. You just want to explain why parties that are supposedly pacifist failed in 3 cases to prevent Italy from going to war. This seems to me a much better way, and then all your arguments work, except for one case, which is that, and this is why, and I'm going to end with this. I think you also overstate yourself in your argument in the title when you say the irrelevance of coalition governments. You know, Prodi's first government fell because on the base of Vicenza, Torigliatto, the extreme left made it fall. So it's not really irrelevant. Well, maybe you have a different story, but that's the story how I remember the first Prodi government falling. So I agree with all your explanations, but it seems to me you can frame them in a more moderate way.
I think there's a lot in what he said, and we're going to have another hour discussing responses. But I'd like just to take a couple of questions from the floor. And if you could please stick it to one question, not 5 or 6.
And also there will be a discussion at the end.
Yeah, there will be a discussion. So please, I see 3 hands up. This one, this one.
My question concerns pragmatism. It's a problem that, to my judgment, and I'd like to hear what you think, does not concern only the Partito Democratico, but if you think about what Ed Miliband did in Syria at Obama's West Point speech last week, it's a problem with the left. And going back to what Ambassador Ferreira was saying before, he said Italy is the country that is not dealing well with the idea that the world is changed. I personally think that Italy, since we have a rhetoric of decline that it goes on since 5, 6, 10 years, it is a country where the idea that the world is changed is deeply rooted. And we kind of take as ours pragmatism because it's the only instrument we can have. And so we kind of put it within a framework. Good, bad, you can judge it, but it goes there. While for the other countries, it's worse. And I think just another second question.
No, sorry.
In the face of Syria, where does the democratic foreign policy stand?
Yeah, we got that. Yeah. Okay. Could you just say who you are?
Okay. My question is very simple. It was the first statement, very interesting, but it picked up a little bit what the discussant was saying, extreme and radical in his use of language. I mean, do we characterize people by what they say or what they do? Simple as that.
Okay, one question. Yeah.
Thanks. My question is for Elisabetta Pegni and Ilya Tuni. To what extent do you think that the ongoing economic crisis, with all its emphasis on austerity measures, budget constraints, and cuts, even cuts in military spending, had an impact on this lack of articulation of foreign policy discourse by the Democratic Party? Thanks.
Okay. And I have just one question as well, which is I think none of you really answered the question in the title. You're kind of skirting around it, and you didn't answer directly your own question about the title. And I will add two other things that I think were implicit as well, is that do we have a post-national and post-Westphalian situation, which I think might help answer many of the points that have come up. So let's take the answer, just each one, very briefly, because we are. So let's go first.
So very quickly on extremity, as I was saying to Carlo before, in part whether we even need to answer this question depends on which venue we decide to try to publish the article in. But let's say for sake of argument that we want to publish it in an international relations venue and want to defend this, which I think we can. It's basically, within the literature, Carbo and Beasley refer to extreme foreign policies as those that, and so there varies a little bit depending on the cases, are the rejection of cooperation with others. And so in the case of Kosovo and Afghanistan, the fact that NATO was engaging in these activities, if Italy had chosen not to, it wouldn't have been cooperating. And I should have specified this better in the paper, and I didn't. Okay, so I'll admit that. And then the second is immobilism in the face of a crisis, which is more Albania, which is you have this crisis that was negatively impacting Italy, and if Italy hadn't acted, it would have had negative consequences on it. And then finally, in terms of the same point, Professor Gilbert, yes, I think that's in fact the great thing that's interesting in terms of the paper is the rhetoric from the leaders of these parties was, we're opposed to all these operations, but they're not willing to do something costly to stop it from happening. And so the only thing they are able to do is to affect the implementation and to engage in the outcome.
In that case, why call them extreme?
Well, they are radical on other issues, and they're radical, I guess, yeah, but it's a fair point.
Yeah, and just briefly about Vicenza and how they are irrelevant. Yeah, probably strong term. In a sense, also one of the policies emphasize how through theatrical politics and implementation they try to affect, in a sense, the operation. However, obviously, despite the huge disagreement on the mission, they didn't threaten the survival of the government at the end.
So la leva design dove poi ci stati all'uso
there was a crisis in 2008.
That's exceptional. It never happened in this.
There was a huge crisis. No, absolutely. There was a huge crisis impact together in 2007 on Vicenza and Afghanistan. However, it was the two rebel senators, and then after the crisis, the three parties, the Fondazione Comunisti Italiani and others, voted in favor of the confidence vote, supporting the government on a point where there was a huge disagreement, and these two rebels, in a sense, they were more coherent than the others, and despite this huge disagreement, they continued to support them.
Okay, thanks.
It's not
Jean-Pierre?
Yes, well, I have to say that I'm quite on the same position as Jacopo Capelle. I don't know, I didn't thought I was coming here today and would be a defensor of the Renzi government, but everything's happened. Yeah, I do think that Italy is the post-Westphalian, very interesting model, which with somehow a realism puts together all kind of constituencies, including human rights, including some intervention. Yes, there is a difference because Garibaldi, whatever, export the revolution tradition. Somehow Emma Bonino, when you talk to her, I remember talking to her, still thinks about it. But in Italy, it's not. No, it has somehow disappeared. And I don't know if it's a left tradition completely. It was also a Republican tradition. I don't know, can be not completely in fact to the left. Nevertheless, and today Italy, I think, well, there are in the debate today, they often quote 2011 Libya as a very bad example, as all bad French, bad UK people went for intervention and they created a mess, and we were somehow forced to follow them, and now our troubles are linked to that, which reinforces this analysis of not intervention. By the way, it could be now there could be some difficulties in the future for Italy to participate to military. But nevertheless, I mean, there are other things with that. You know, we said that the growing importance of Matteo Renzi's and the PD in Europe within the Socialist Party, the fact that France is completely blocked inside and has difficulties with pressure model. I mean, you can add a lot of things. And yes, this post-Westphalia, which problematics, and when we think of non-state actors and the problems they can raise, those are not the companies. Not ENI, not Finmeccanica, I know that very well. Okay, they are into the loop, but no, that's not the bad one. The other actors, the association, Catholics, whatever, create sometimes a mess to be coordinated on a local level or national level. I mean, it's much more worrisome to some extent. But those worries are not so bad. It's a very lively model which is adapting, you know, the so-called sistema paese, internationalization. That's a concept I cannot even translate in French because it doesn't exist. It shows that Italy system, Italy model has some reaction. It's quite playing its ways through the 21st century.
Okay, couple of points. First point about theory. Well, this is not like a theory paper, a used theory, but if you want like somehow a big reference to theory, I'll have to tell you to go and look at the article that was published in well, last year, I think, or the year before. But what I mean by realism, I'm pretty much coming to the argument that ideas do count, perceptions do count, domestic politics does count, but I think ideas are also limited by material reality and by the material resources that countries are at their disposal. We still live in a world where transnational movements or globalization may have partially led us into a post-Westphalian system, but still in a world that is made up of states at the international level. And I think Italy is constrained by its own somehow material position in the power distribution. So also when we talk about the idea of a reactive or proactive Italian foreign policy, I think also here we see like a historical continuity. It has been pretty much proactive at the regional level, and this is a tradition that goes back again in the past century, the one before. But I think empirically we have pretty much a demonstration that has been reactive when it comes to this systemic level. Maybe there is one aspect in which Italy has been kind of proactive, is the idea of European integration, but that also has been dictated, of course, by values, but also by empirical, the material situation in which the country was after World War II. And let me conclude with 2 points. Even if I go back to the PCI, I go back to history, it was Stalin himself that somehow warned Italian communist leaders that Italy would struggle somehow to assert itself in a position of equidistance between the two blocs after our World War II came to an end. And today, after all, we spoke about Renzi, we spoke about the center, domestic politics. Well, don't forget that we've had ideas, illusions, proposals from the left, but also from the right, that, of course, we didn't touch upon today. But after all, today, the two lodestars that continue to shape Italian foreign policy, well, membership of NATO and support for European integration, that are shared substantially from the right to the left, they were made by the center somehow. So I think that tells a lot about our ideas are constrained.
Yeah, just one line. Well, first of all, thank you for the comments, really, for engaging with the paper, and thanks for the questions. I think I will literally say, using Carlo's words, in terms of the post-Westphalian, post-ideological, post-national, etc., post-ideological is ideological. There is an ideology to the post-ideology. And that has to do with the economic crisis. That has to do with the globalization. And it may be that the center-left has, you know, administered neoliberalism, you know, and this is something that hopefully will come, you know, will be talked about even later. So I would just leave it at that.
Okay, to start.
Yeah, sure.
Very short comment to Carlo and to Lee as well. Yeah, so the point of our paper is not to argue about the greatness of a certain narrative as opposed to another one. Absolutely not. What we're talking about is not like the content of the ideas, but the process of theoretical elaboration. So what we're arguing there is that what we see in the PD's foreign policy, we're not comparing it to the PCR or anything else, it's just a case study, that there we see a lack of critical thinking, of elaboration, of theory development. That's it. And then, of course, your point about pragmatism, sort of a common vision, can find again in the narratives of all left-wing parties across Europe. You're right, I agree with you. But to me, this just shows that any kind of effort of left-wing national parties to repeat themselves needs to be done in a sort of transnational framework that, like all European parties, are sort of affected by same exogenous factors and need to repeat themselves, and they're doing that now. And that pragmatism is one of the ideas they came up with to answer these challenges. One of the possible ones. So that means it's a little bit of the same. Pragmatism as an idea itself, not as a lack of ideas.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've had
Grazie mille, poi vabbè parliamo col caso.
Cioè, non ho capito. Poi non è capito perché. Però poi si presta lo stesso.
Lo guardiamo.
Una mano, quello vuol fare se non faccia la muovete, qual è la risposta?
Però ricademi dalle mani.
Quando successo di aperture divisive, questo fa il
allora, no, cioè, noi abbiamo fatto una creazione
ma infatti secondo me non è il bambino non deve essere un via con l'acqua sporca, però da qua a dire che gli altri paesi
no, però
poi c'è fai
no, però dire che non c'è il dibattito interno.
Noi diciamo che non c'è la discussione, diciamo assolutamente no, ma attenzione, noi diciamo